He thought he had the perfect marriage, a loving wife, 2 wonderful kids, and a stable home. But when late nights turned into unanswered calls and secrets began piling up, he realized the truth was much darker. His wife had been living a double life, and when he uncovered her betrayal, he didn't just walk away, he made sure she lost everything. But months later she called him, begging for another chance. His response? Cold. Final. Unforgiving. Ethan Sullivan had always prided himself on being a man of routine. His life was structured, predictable, and most importantly, stable. He had built a life around consistency, ensuring that his wife, Madeline, and their 2 children, Isabel and Owen, never had to worry about anything. Their weekends followed the same rhythm: breakfast at a familiar cafe, afternoons at the park, and evenings spent together. But lately, something had shifted. Madeline had always been dedicated to her career in real estate, but her schedule had grown increasingly erratic. Late nights became the norm, her presence at home more fleeting. Ethan reasoned with himself that it was simply the demands of the job. Yet a persistent unease settled within him, one he couldn't shake. One Sunday morning, they gathered at their usual cafe. The rich scent of freshly brewed coffee and warm pastries filled the air, a comfort Ethan had come to associate with family time. Across from him, Madeline scrolled through her phone, barely engaged in the conversation around her. Isabel eagerly spoke about an upcoming school project, her voice animated. Madeline responded with a brief nod, her fingers still tapping on the screen. A glance at her watch, a sigh, and then a quiet announcement: she had a meeting, one that couldn't be postponed. Ethan observed his daughter's expression falter, and Owen quietly poked at his breakfast, his earlier excitement fading. Ethan reassured them with a plan for the afternoon, promising time together. Still, the absence was felt. As Madeline left the cafe, the sound of her heels fading into the distance, he watched her go, a nagging sensation tightening in his chest. Over the following weeks, her absence deepened. Conversations between them grew shorter, interactions more perfunctory. Her phone was always within reach, always turned away when he entered the room. Ethan convinced himself that stress was the culprit, but doubt crept in, forming cracks in the trust he had never before questioned. One evening, his sister, Claire, visited for dinner. She had a way of noticing things others ignored, her intuition sharp. As the evening unfolded, she observed the unspoken tension between Ethan and Madeline. When Madeline excused herself for yet another call, Claire leaned closer, her voice low. She asked if everything was all right. Ethan hesitated before admitting that things had changed. He explained that Madeline's work had become overwhelming, that time together had dwindled. Claire's expression remained unreadable before she finally spoke. Sometimes, instincts picked up on what logic tried to dismiss. If something felt wrong, it often was. That night, her words echoed in his mind. As he lay in bed beside Madeline, staring at the ceiling, he wondered when the distance had begun, when the ease between them had disappeared. The woman he had shared his life with felt like a stranger. 2 weeks later, Ethan was in his garage, working on an old car, the scent of motor oil thick in the air. The familiar rhythm of the work was grounding, a distraction from the thoughts that refused to settle. The sound of footsteps approaching caught his attention. Danielle Harper, one of Madeline's closest friends and colleagues, hesitated at the entrance. There was uncertainty in her posture, a flicker of hesitation before she spoke. She mentioned that she had been supposed to meet Madeline for coffee, but her calls had gone unanswered. Ethan wiped his hands, frowning. Madeline had told him she had a late showing, one that would keep her tied up for the evening. Danielle seemed puzzled by the contradiction, her brows knitting together as she considered it. Ethan forced a neutral expression, offering a simple explanation. Perhaps there had been a scheduling error. Danielle nodded, but her doubt was evident. She asked him to let Madeline know she had stopped by before turning to leave. Ethan assured her he would pass along the message, but as she walked away, a cold unease settled in his chest. Alone in his office that night, he pieced together the inconsistencies. The excuses, the guarded phone, the unexpected absences. Trust had been his foundation, but now it felt unsteady beneath him. He wanted to believe he was imagining it, but deep down, he knew something wasn't right. And he had to find out the truth. Ethan Sullivan had always believed that honesty was the foundation of any strong relationship. For years, he had trusted Madeline without hesitation, never once questioning her loyalty. But trust was a fragile thing, and in recent weeks, he felt its foundation cracking beneath him. Something was wrong, and the pieces weren't adding up. With every late-night meeting, every unanswered phone call, and every vague excuse, his suspicions grew. He tried to suppress them, convincing himself that his mind was playing tricks on him, that stress was warping his perception. But deep down, a quiet voice kept whispering the same unsettling thought: he was being deceived. Determined to uncover the truth, Ethan began observing more carefully. He paid closer attention to the way Madeline spoke, the way she glanced at her phone with an expression that bordered on nervousness. Her schedule was inconsistent, her explanations vague. He started taking note of the days and times she claimed to be working, cross-referencing them with her past routines. Patterns began to emerge, and they only deepened his unease. One evening, as Madeline was preparing to leave for another supposed meeting, Ethan made a mental note of the time. Once she was gone, he sat in silence, his thoughts racing. After an hour, he checked the location-sharing app they had once used casually to coordinate errands. Madeline had disabled hers. That was the moment his doubts solidified into certainty. The next morning, he reached out to a private investigator. Hank Lawson had been recommended by a colleague, discreet, professional, and thorough. When Ethan met him at a small office on the outskirts of town, the detective wasted no time. "What exactly are we looking for?" Hank's voice was calm, his gaze sharp. Ethan exhaled slowly. "I need to know if my wife is being honest with me." Hank gave a small nod. "I'll start with surveillance. I'll track her movements, see where she's going, who she's meeting. If there's something to find, I'll find it." Days passed, each one weighed down by anticipation. Ethan carried on as if everything were normal, but the tension gnawed at him. When Madeline left in the evenings, he resisted the urge to question her, knowing that soon he would have undeniable proof, one way or another. A week later, his phone buzzed with an incoming call. Hank's voice was measured, but the words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. "You should come by. I have something you'll want to see." When Ethan arrived at the investigator's office, Hank slid a folder across the desk. Inside were photos: Madeline in the parking lot of a hotel, meeting a man Ethan had never seen before. Different locations, different days, always the same man. The timestamps on the photos confirmed what Ethan had feared. The betrayal was real. For a long moment, he simply stared at the images, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were seeing. He had suspected, but to have it confirmed in such stark detail made it feel as though the ground had been pulled from beneath him. Hank's voice cut through the fog of his thoughts. "I can keep digging, see what else she's hiding." Ethan closed the folder and shook his head. "No. This is enough." He left the office in a daze, gripping the folder so tightly his knuckles turned white. As he drove home, a storm of emotions raged within him: anger, sorrow, disbelief. The woman he had built a life with, the person he had trusted above all else, had shattered everything. That night, as Madeline slept beside him, Ethan remained awake, staring at the ceiling. The choice before him was clear: confrontation or strategy. And Ethan Sullivan had never been a man to act on impulse. If Madeline thought she had fooled him, she was wrong. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Ethan Sullivan had always believed that careful planning was the key to overcoming any crisis. Now, staring at the undeniable evidence of Madeline's betrayal, he knew that impulsive actions would only lead to regret. He needed control. He needed a plan. The days that followed were a test of restraint. Each morning, he acted as though nothing had changed, greeting Madeline with the same steady tone, watching as she went about her routine, unaware that her secret was already in his hands. At night, when she returned home late, he measured every word carefully, feigning indifference while studying her every move. The more he observed, the clearer the picture became. She wasn't just careless, she was confident, convinced that she had outsmarted him. Ethan's first move was quiet preparation. He contacted his lawyer, Lauren Mitchell, a no-nonsense woman with a reputation for securing ironclad settlements. Without revealing too much, he laid out his concerns and inquired about his options. She listened intently, then gave him a measured response: document everything, maintain composure, and ensure that when the time came, he held the upper hand. Following her advice, he began gathering financial records. Bank statements, investment portfolios, property deeds, anything that could be used to shield his assets when the inevitable confrontation arrived. He discovered transfers he hadn't authorized, withdrawals that didn't align with their usual expenses. The deception ran deeper than he had anticipated. The next step was setting the groundwork for custody. Isabel and Owen were his priority, and he refused to let them become collateral damage in the fallout. He reached out to trusted friends and family, subtly laying the foundation of support. Conversations were carefully worded, planting the seeds of doubt about Madeline's reliability without making outright accusations. His goal was simple: when the truth surfaced, no one would be surprised at his decision to fight for full custody. As the weeks stretched on, Ethan's patience was tested. Madeline continued her charade, unaware that every lie she told was being meticulously logged. He intercepted a message on their shared tablet, an intimate exchange between her and the man in the photographs. It was confirmation beyond any doubt. The evidence piled up, and with it, his resolve hardened. Then came the opportunity he had been waiting for. A real estate event was scheduled in the city, one that Madeline had mentioned attending. Ethan made no indication that he knew about it, allowing her to go as planned. But instead of heading home that evening, he waited outside the venue, blending into the background, unnoticed. When she emerged from the building, she wasn't alone. The man from the photos walked beside her, his hand grazing her lower back as they laughed, completely at ease. The sight was sobering, but Ethan felt no anger, just certainty. This was all the proof he needed. He left without making his presence known. There was no need for a dramatic confrontation, no public spectacle. His victory wouldn't be won through words. It would be secured through action. That night, as Madeline entered their home, Ethan greeted her as he always did, his voice steady, his expression unreadable. He had made his decision. The groundwork was set. And soon, she would understand just how deeply she had underestimated him. Ethan Sullivan had spent weeks preparing for this moment. Every detail had been meticulously arranged, every potential obstacle accounted for. He wasn't a man who acted on emotion alone. Strategy was his strength, and now, it was his weapon. The morning of the confrontation was deceptively ordinary. Madeline moved through the house with her usual air of detachment, sipping coffee, checking her phone, glancing at her reflection in the hallway mirror. She had no idea that today would be different. Ethan had already met with his lawyer earlier in the week. The divorce paperwork was drafted, the financial accounts had been secured, and key individuals had been quietly informed of what was to come. The foundation was laid, and now, it was time to deliver the final blow. When Madeline returned home that evening, Ethan was waiting. He had placed the neatly stacked evidence on the kitchen table: photos, bank statements, message logs. He sat calmly, hands folded in front of him, watching as she entered. The moment she saw the documents, her posture stiffened. She didn't speak right away. Her eyes darted across the table, taking in the weight of what was in front of her. The facade cracked for just a moment, the realization dawning that her deception was no longer a secret. "I know everything," Ethan said, his voice measured. He had imagined this conversation countless times, but now that it was happening, he felt nothing but resolve. Madeline exhaled, her shoulders dropping. There was no denial, no feigned confusion. She understood that the time for lies had passed. "What happens now?" she finally asked, her voice quieter than usual. Ethan slid a legal envelope toward her. "This. Divorce papers. You won't be contesting them?" She hesitated, then picked up the envelope, flipping it open with careful fingers. Her expression remained unreadable as she scanned the contents. "You think you can just decide how this ends?" she muttered, more to herself than to him. Ethan leaned back, his gaze unwavering. "It's already decided." He had ensured that the financial aspects were airtight. The assets she had attempted to divert had been recovered. The legal documentation was in his favor. And most importantly, the case for full custody of their children was ironclad. He would not allow her betrayal to upend their lives any more than it already had. Madeline seemed to understand that arguing was pointless. She let the papers rest in her lap, staring at the documents without really seeing them. For the first time in weeks, Ethan felt a sense of finality settle over him. He had done everything necessary to protect himself and his children. There would be no second chances, no drawn-out emotional battles. The damage had been done, and now, it was time to move forward. As he stood to leave the room, he paused only once. "You'll hear from my lawyer about the next steps. This is done." He walked away, the weight that had been pressing on his chest for so long finally beginning to lift. Madeline had made her choices. Now, she would live with the consequences. Months had passed since Ethan Sullivan had walked away from his marriage, leaving behind the wreckage of deception and betrayal. The legal battle had been swift and decisive. Madeline had no ground to stand on. Custody of the children was granted to him, the divorce was finalized without dispute, and the life they had once shared became nothing more than a memory. Despite everything, rebuilding wasn't easy. The house felt different, emptier. The echoes of the past lingered in every room, but Ethan was determined to move forward. Isabel and Owen had adjusted better than he had expected. The absence of tension, of whispered phone calls and unexplained absences, had given them a new sense of stability. Routine became their anchor, morning breakfasts together, homework at the kitchen table, weekend trips to the park. Slowly, they were finding their way back to normal. One evening, as he sorted through old paperwork, his phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. He hesitated before answering, already sensing what was coming. Madeline's voice came through, quiet and uncertain, a hesitant request to see the children. There was no anger in her tone, only the remnants of something unresolved, something too late to fix. She spoke as if hoping for a different outcome, as if the past could be rewritten with a simple conversation. Ethan kept his response measured. The custody agreement was clear, and nothing had changed. There would be no unscheduled visits, no sudden returns to what once was. She pressed, trying to find space for negotiation, but there was nothing left to argue. The damage had been done, and their children deserved stability, not uncertainty. The conversation ended as expected, unfinished, words lingering without resolution. As the weeks passed, Ethan focused on building something real, something his children could rely on. The auto repair business he had once dreamed of was now a reality, a small but steady shop built with hard work and quiet determination. Friends and family showed their support, and as trust in his work grew, so did his reputation. He found solace in the simplicity of honest labor, in the steady rhythm of a life moving forward. One afternoon, as he locked up the shop, he noticed a familiar figure near the entrance. Rachel, the school counselor who had been guiding Isabel and Owen through the changes in their lives, stood studying the sign above the door. When she turned, there was warmth in her expression, a quiet understanding that required no explanation. She mentioned stopping by to check in, a casual observation about how well the children were adjusting. There was no rush in her words, no need for anything beyond the present moment. As they spoke, there was an ease between them, a conversation that flowed naturally. She made a passing remark about the shop's reputation, a light comment that left room for something more. Ethan found himself smiling, not because of what was said, but because of the possibility it carried. As she walked away, something settled in him, something lighter, something less burdened by the past. He drove home that evening with a quiet sense of certainty, knowing Isabel and Owen would be there, waiting for him. The weight of the past had finally begun to lift, replaced by the steady, unwavering belief that they were going to be okay. For the first time in a long while, that was enough.